Revenge in the Army. I was in the Army, and while away on a 4-day pass, my barracks room was broken into and a significant amount of my military equipment, helmet, backpack, weapons, web belt, ammo carrier, etc., was stolen, to the tune of approximately $800 in 1984 dollars. When L returned, there were tool marks on the locked room door and it was clearly a break-in. I notified my platoon sergeant and first sergeant, and they said to call the military police. Then the company commander/commanding officer, who outranked us, called me and stated he didn't want the break-in being reported to the military police because then our company would show up in the higher level, division, police blotter, and this would make him, the company commander/commanding officer, CO, look bad. So he told me to do a report of survey, a form used to be reimbursed for lost equipment, and L wouldn't have to pay for the stolen equipment, whose replacement costs were a month's pay. Well, L submitted the paperwork, and without the police report, my request to be reimbursed was denied and L was told L would have to pay for all the stolen equipment. I was shocked because it was a lot of money and L was just about to leave the Army to go back to college. I needed that money to survive. The CO told me that was a tough break and there was nothing he could do to help me, even though it was his orders L had followed. Well, turns out, just a week before we found out the division would not replace my stolen equipment, L had led our company through a nuclear, biological and chemical weapons evaluation exercise. That was my specialty in the Army, and the spineless CO sat out the exercise and just observed. This placed me in a leadership position to do his job, while a captain from our division HQ graded our actions. I was a junior sergeant who had to maneuver, lead and direct the whole company of 120 men, including senior lieutenants, to a staging area 5 miles away, through the security procedures to secure the decontamination site and then lead the cleaning of our men, tanks and equipment from the simulated chemical attack. I had never maneuvered an armored company before, but Al did it, and the other sergeants and lieutenants in the unit were shocked that the CO hadn't helped me during the exercise. The process went well, and at the end, a captain from division who was evaluating us, congratulated me on doing a good job. In front of the company, this captain then explained our next steps we would do. He made a mistake and told the troops wrong information, that in combat would get them killed. I was leaving the Army, but Al cared enough about my fellow soldiers to want them to be combat proficient. So politely, and respectfully Al corrected what the captain had said, but he clearly resented me making him look silly. I guess he was embarrassed a lower-ranking soldier corrected him and that made him noticeably embarrassed. At the end of the debriefing, L was walking back to my armored vehicle to radio our HQ that now we had completed our decontamination, a requirement of the exercise, and were operational again, and this captain followed me, away from the other soldiers. He asked what L was going to do, and L told him L was about to make the radio call to HQ, and he told me that wouldn't be necessary, L could just tell him what L would say. I told him and he told me our unit had passed the evaluation. Luckily for me, my first sergeant overheard him say this to me. Now fast forward to where L find out that my equipment would not be replaced, and a couple days later, L was called into the CO's office with my first sergeant and told our company had flunked the training evaluation because L hadn't made that radio call. I was getting out of the Army, so didn't really care, but it was bad news for my CO. I was shocked because the other captain, who outranked me, told me not to make the radio call that our unit was decontaminated and operational again. Turns out that the captain was immature and mad at me since Al had embarrassed him in front of all the soldiers in my unit. I still was angry at the CO for ordering me not to call the police about my barracks room break-in, and how he didn't care that L would now have to pay a lot of money to replace my stolen equipment. So L didn't defend myself or tell the CO what really happened with the evaluation or that captain. When I left the CO's office, the first sergeant told me he heard the other captain tell me not to make that radio call, but not to say anything. Our CO was a jerk who would get us all killed in a war, and his unit flunking the evaluation made him look really bad, so he asked me to keep my mouth shut. A couple weeks later, the CO was rude to a sick soldier in our unit, while L was out processing to leave the Army. Everyone hated him even more for this. So our supply sergeant, who was retiring from the Army, and after the CO signed for all the military equipment in the supply room, told me he couldn't believe the CO had screwed me over on my stolen equipment and that he would help me. So he handed me the keys to the supply room that the CO hadn't collected, and told me to take whatever military equipment L would need to replace my stolen equipment, since the CO was now responsible to replace everything in the supply room with his money. He also apologized that some of the replacement equipment L would need was not in the supply room, and he felt bad L would still have to pay a couple $100s out of pocket to replace some of the stolen equipment. The supply sergeant also answered my questions about where all the backup training logs for our unit's weapons and physical training tests were kept. We were about to be inspected by higher headquarters, and these records were super important for the CO to pass the inspection and be promoted and not be kicked out of the Army. The day before L got out of the Army with an honorable discharge, and just a couple days before this huge important inspection, it was discovered that the whole company's year's worth of weapons training records, the backup records and electronic records were missing or wiped clean. The CO had to explain this embarrassing situation to his bosses, who were not happy with him. His unit had already flunked the NBC evaluation, and now his unit had failed to properly maintain training records. Even worse, his unit's training budget was completely over budget, with costs off the charts, and the division had to come up with a lot of money to cover the ammo costs to requalify the whole company on all our weapons, plus time from other duties to redo our physical tests, PT, of running, push-ups etc. Just as bad, advanced training would have to be cancelled to redo all the basic weapons qualification training that had to be completed once again. There was no way the CO could avoid receiving a bad performance appraisal, which would end any chance of him getting promoted, thus effectively ending his military career. Meanwhile, my fellow soldiers loved it because they liked to shoot machine guns, throw grenades, shoot cannons etc. My last day in the Army, at morning formation, as everyone was getting ready to do the makeup PT test and later all day doing makeup weapon qualifications for several more days, my awesome first sergeant told me that the disappearing records was the best ETS, and term of service, prank he had ever seen. I of course replied that L didn't know what he was talking about. He laughed, winked at me and told me L was a good soldier and that he would miss me. He then shook my hand and wished me well. A homophobe insulted my daughter. I may have ended his marriage. So my daughter, 15, has been friends with a girl who lives opposite for years now, and in the past there have been sleepovers at both our houses. Adults always stopped and chatted when we saw each other etc. Last year my daughter came out as lesbian, and a short while later we noticed that our friends across the road never seemed to want to chat anymore. Recently my daughter told me her friend had messaged her to say that she wasn't allowed around our house anymore. Yesterday I saw them on the road and I decided I was going to have a friendly chat and see if I could resolve the issue. It didn't stay friendly very long. Dickhead dad was acting oddly agitated when I brought it up and ended up saying, "I'm not letting your fucking queer daughter try and do stuff too." Redacted. Just because you raised a freak doesn't mean we all have to like it. Side note for anyone who doesn't know, although the term queer has been somewhat reclaimed by the LGBTQ+ community in recent years, it has a long history of being used as a homophobic slur, and Dickhead Dad definitely wasn't using it as an ally. Now, for the next part it's important to know 4 things. Dickhead Dad has been working from home since the pandemic started. His wife hasn't been works each day. I have been working from home due to injury for a few weeks now. I've seen the woman who visits for a few hours a couple of times a week, and I've seen him smack her ass as she leaves. I stay nice and calm. I take a breath and then I press the button. I calmly explain to Dickhead Dad that just because my daughter is gay doesn't mean that she would be trying to make a move on a friend. After all, I say, men and women can be friends without it being sexual. Just like you and the blonde girl who keeps coming round. He got pretty mad and called me some amazing names as his wife stomped back to their house. I'm guessing things got pretty bad as he left the house less than an hour later with a suitcase and a big gym bag and drove off, tires screeching. I do feel sorry for the daughter if I'm honest, and if only for her I did wish afterwards I'd kept my mouth shut. Not sorry for him though. Hurt my family? Guess you'll die. My grandfather grew up in a rural Peruvian town where only his family lived, very isolated from others. They lived about half an hour away from the nearest town. This story happened sometime in the 1940s. As one would assume, everyone was close. This story is about one of my grandfather's many cousins, let's call her Mary, 20, and her husband, Peter, 25. Mary's dad went away to work in the capital for a while, taking Mary with him. There, she met Peter, fell in love, and married. They returned to town a couple of months after they wed. They rented the room at the local saloon, I think that's the word anyway, while Peter worked with Mary's dad selling goods in neighboring Dos to save money. Turns out, Peter was an asshole. Not only did he cheat on Mary while he was away working, but he also severely beat her when he was home, even more than the standard at the time. Eventually, the owner of the saloon, a distant cousin of Mary, noticed, hereby called owner, Dilda 50. He confronted her, and after a lot of prodding, she admitted to everything. She hadn't confessed before as her close family, especially her dad, opposed the marriage, and she was ashamed to admit Peter was an abuser. Well, she wouldn't have to suffer much longer, as owner would take matters into his own hands. He liked to play a prank on newcomers. He would take them to a field a half-hour away to hunt what he claimed was the most delicious bird he had ever tasted. Spoiler alert, that bird did not exist. It had a funny name I can't remember, so I'll just call it Birdie. He would leave them in the middle of the field with a net while he went away to chase the birdies into the net. He would then walk back to town while the newcomer was kept waiting for the birdies. Eventually, newcomer would return to town and be mocked and laughed at for buying the story. Just some good old, rural town fun. He had yet to prank Peter as he was mostly away working and working. However, not long after an opportunity presented itself. He was able to lead Peter away with the same story as always, but he didn't play the prank on him. Instead, he led him to a field 1.5 to 2 hours away instead, getting him drunk on the way, and then pushed him into a nearby lake where he drowned. He then returned to town and claimed Peter had wanted to actually hunt the birds, not just wait, and it was hard to convince him otherwise as a way to excuse his tardiness. Peter's disappearance was noticed the next day by Mary's dad when he didn't show up to his house or work and when he wasn't in the rented room. Owner gave his excuse, the others at the saloon and his wife corroborated his story. A few days later, Peter was found drowned in the lake. It was concluded that while waiting for the birdies, he'd gotten drunk, and when he attempted to return to town, he had gotten lost and fallen into the lake. Unlike her husband, Mary's life ended on a happy note. She remarried to a much nicer man, had 8 children, and bought a house in the capital where she lived until she died of cancer circa 2003. The amazing owner also had a happy life and died in the late 1970s. My grandfather only knew this story because he overheard owner tell Mary's dad the true story. Apart from him, no one else but the 3 of them knew. He told me one day I was asking about secrets about his small town. Yes, I like gossip.